Welcome to the video that goes over some of the basics regarding APA, especially as that information applies to quantitatively related content. Hopefully this will be useful to you. Obviously you can stop and rewind as much as you want, replay the video as much as you want, and you can skip through segments that you feel you already know well. The information I'd like to share with you today comes directly from the APA 6th edition of the manual, and in almost every case I have the section number from which the information is derived. So we'll begin with in-text citations. The information that you include in the narrative, if it comes from multiple authors, should use the word "and" before the last author. The example would be something like this, where here there are 3 authors of this particular document. Before the last one you use the word "and." Because it is in the narrative, you cannot use symbols to replace words in narrative. You have to use the words themselves. The kind of alternative to that is if you choose to incorporate the author names as part of a parenthetical citation at the end of a sentence, then you use the ampersand. So the symbol is appropriate to use there, not the full word "and", but in the narrative itself you use the word. So here, because the citation comes in the parentheses, we see the ampersand. The publication year should immediately follow the name of the last author in the sequence, so don't wait until the end of the sentence to put the publication year if you are including the authors in the narrative itself. If there are 3 or more authors, then you use the first author in the list, et al. All has a period at the end of it, et does not. And you begin using that the second time that list of authors appears or is cited in your document and thereafter. So the first time you have to list all of the author names unless there are 6 and more authors. In that case, refer to the APA manual for more guidance. But anytime you refer to the same series of authors, 3 or more, multiple times, then you only have to provide the full citation in the text the first time. So the example would be something like this. Again, the period only comes after the "all", not after the "et". There's no comma after the name of the author, and that's pretty much how it goes. In terms of verb tenses, what APA says is if you are talking about your own ideas, such as in Chapter 1 of a dissertation or introductory sections of another type of document, that you should write about those ideas in present tense. You use past tense when you refer to existing literature, which means anytime you talk about things that other people have written, that information should be written in past tense. They have already said it, and this is a common error that people make. This holds sometimes in Chapter 1 or introductory sections when you refer to what others have written. Also, when you're in your Chapter 2 discussing literature that already exists, that all should be past tense. Also, although it might not seem intuitive at the time that you're writing it, APA says that when you write about the results of your own study, use past tense verbs to do so. When somebody is reading about the results of your study, they will be reading it as if the study has already occurred. So even though it might seem like present tense at the time that you're writing it, you kind of have to think a little differently about that. And then in your discussion or conclusions sections of either a document or Chapter 5 of a dissertation, use present tense verbs to talk about how the results of your study can be applied to practice and policies, and all the implications that you want to share with the reader. In terms of the headers that you use, what APA says is level 0 is your chapter number or title of a document. This refers more to your dissertation more so than documents that you might submit for other classes or for publication. But APA says that that should be centered and in all caps, not bolded. So your chapter titles, all caps, centered, no bold. And then your first level of header will be centered and bolded. If you have to go to a second level of header, which happens at times, so subsections within, let's say, a review of literature, for example, that would be flush left and bolded. And if you do have to go in one more level, then that next header would be indented, so you tab over, you bold it, you end that with a period, and then you begin the narrative on that same line, so you don't skip a line in between. In terms of agreement between subject and verb, make sure that the subject and the verb do agree in numbers. So if you have a singular subject, that you pair that with the singular verb, and also true for plural words. So if you have phrases such as together with, as well as, and others, think about removing that intervening phrase to help you understand whether what you're trying to match is a singular or a plural instance. So an incorrect example would be if you said the percentage of correct responses as well as the speed of the responses increase with practice. The problem with that is percentage it's a singular word, so because of that you have to use increases, which is the singular version of the verb. Also, APA specifies the word data in particular, and that applies to our class as well. Data is a plural word. I know it's often used incorrectly, but you need to say, in order to be in compliance with APA, data were, data are, not data is. Datum is the singular version of the word. It's hardly ever used. So just try to get in your mind that data should be paired with a plural verb. In terms of pronouns, pronouns are words that replace nouns, and it has to agree with the rest of the sentence in terms of the number and the gender. So in this case, neither the highest scorer nor the lowest scorer in the group had any doubt about their competence. That's wrong because scorer is singular, but there is a plural pronoun. So there's inconsistency in that sentence. What would be correct if you said, would be if you said neither the highest scorer, so here we again have the singular word, and we replace it with his or her, which is also singular. So you can't use there to replace or to make something gender neutral. Well, it's definitely frowned upon to do that. So keep singular nouns with singular pronouns. Also, a common error, and APA specifies this in section 3.20, is that when you are using a pronoun to represent a human, you need to pair it with who. So a lot of times people want to say the students that, which is incorrect because students are human, and that means that students need to be replaced with who in the sentence. Then getting to some of our quantitatively related information. So when you are working with numbers, how do you know whether you should write the number as a digit or as a word? What APA says is you should use digits anytime you are using numbers 10 and above, anytime you refer to numbers in the abstract of your document, or if you have any kind of graphical display, meaning a figure or a table. Numbers that immediately precede a unit of measurement. The example here would be a 5 milligram dose, but we could say a 5 centimeter long piece of paper or something equivalent. Also, numbers that represent any kind of functions, either statistical functions, mathematical functions, fractional or decimal quantities, percentages, or ratios. So multiplied by 5 would be one example, 3 times as many. So those are words that represent values of something, functions of something. And then numbers that represent time, dates, ages, scores and points on a scale, and exact sums of money. So if you're writing $752 million, you don't write that in words, you use the dollar sign and you write 752, comma 000, comma 000. So we've got some other examples here that you can refer to as well. And then the last one is if you are using numbers to denote a specific place in a series, that's probably the most common one, or each number in a list of 4 or more numbers, then in those situations you would use numerals as well. And here just note that we can write grade 8, which follows this particular rule, but if we're talking about the 8th grade, then you have to write out the word. So if you reword your sentences a little bit, then you can avoid having to write words out. You have to use words to express numbers if the number begins a sentence. So if that's the case, what APA recommends is that you reword the sentence so it doesn't have to start with a number. Also, well, here's an example, 48%. And in this one, 12 students improved, 12 students did not improve. Here, because the number is greater than 10 or 10 or greater, we write it as a numeral, but because the same number starts a sentence here, we have to write it as a word. And then common fractions are also written as a word. Unfortunately, APA doesn't say what they consider common to be, so it's kind of a judgment call in that regard. I would probably rewrite it to say 20% instead of writing it as a fraction, and that way you can avoid any ambiguity in terms of what's common. Then in terms of when do you need to use a 0 with a decimal? If the number itself, if the decimal value itself is a number less than 1, if the value could actually be more than 1, then you have to place a 0 before the decimal. So any kind of unit of measurement can obviously exceed the value of 1. If it's smaller than that, the 0 has to be there. When you're reporting means, you would report a 0 in front. Measures of time, you would report a 0 in front. But if the value is one that cannot be greater than 1, then in that situation you do not put a 0 before the decimal. So in reporting correlations or R values, since R can be a number between -1 and +1, you would not put a 0 before the decimal. Similarly, p-values are between 0 and 1. So in those cases, you would also not put a 0 before the decimal. What APA says in terms of forming plurals of numbers, you just add an S or an ES to the end without adding an apostrophe. So 4s and 6s, notice 1950s does not have an apostrophe S. 10s and 20s no apostrophes. This might not be the same for other types of styles other than APA, but in APA this is what they say, so make sure you follow that if you're using those kinds of words in your writing. APA says that you do not have to provide references to justify your use of different statistical analyses. So you don't have to say an ANOVA will be run to determine differences between the means of the three groups and in parentheses write Green and Salkin. You don't have to do that. You can just say that this is the analysis that will be used, period. So it's a little bit more forgiving than qualitative studies, because in qualitative studies you have to justify just about everything. In quantitative studies, you're basically given the benefit of history, where there's a common agreement and understanding that certain things are appropriate to use at certain times. Also, this doesn't come directly from the APA manual, but I thought it fit in here a little bit. When you are talking about the results of studies that other people have conducted, and they're quantitative studies, so you might want to report some of the key statistical values, the specific language that the authors use in describing their results is really not that critical. In other words, it's not important enough for you to get their exact words to warrant a direct quotation. Better would be to paraphrase that information, still provide a citation for it as appropriate, but you don't need to have the author's words to say something like, statistically significant differences were found between the groups. You can find other ways of saying the same thing without needing a direct quote. You will need to report the numerical values, and obviously those will be repeated from what the authors say, but you don't have to provide a direct quotation for that information. In terms of symbols, the ones that come up a lot would be the percent symbol. And the general rule for that is if you are using a numeral, then you should use the percent symbol after it. If you use a word, then the word percentage would follow it. So you just keep numerals with the symbol, numbers as words with words as well. So just that's kind of a pattern. So if we wrote something like 18% of the students, notice that 18 is written as a numeral because it's a number 10 or larger, and then that would be followed with the percent symbol. There's no space between the number and the percent symbol. Here, if we're talking about percentage of students, it's a word in the narrative, and we need to write the entire word for that reason. So the exception that APA discusses is if you are using percentages inside a table or figure, and so you have a legend or you have a title or a column information at the top of a column to help the reader understand the information, then you use the percent symbol in order to conserve space. And if you are using a statistical term in the narrative, so it's actually part of the sentence, then you have to write the word. So if I said the means were 52.34 and 48.89, then because I'm using those values in the sentence proper, I have to write the word mean. But if you put that information inside a parenthetical component of, so it's sort of an aside within the sentence, then you can use the symbols. So males score higher, parentheses, here's the mean, here's the standard deviation, than females. So now the statistical values are an aside, not a part of the main portion of the sentence, so then the symbols can be used. And then uppercase italicized N refers to the entire sample size, whereas a lowercase italicized n refers to the number of people in any subgroup from within the sample. In terms of tables, the table that you see right here complies with APA, and I'm going to point out all of the things that are important to kind of keep in mind when constructing tables. So first off, table numbers appear in a row by itself above the table, not in italics, not bolded, no punctuation. The T in the table is capitalized. The title appears in a row below the table number. The title itself is in italics. The first letter of all the main words, so you notice O and of is not italicized, but generally most words are. I'm sorry, it's italicized, but it's not capitalized. So the first letter of each main word is capitalized. No period at the end. The letters that represent statistical values are italicized. So in our column headers, we reflect those. And as I said before, we have a small n here because this is subgroup size. Here's eta square. APA says that your tables need to include the appropriate effect size. So because this would be a table that comes from an ANOVA or equivalent, then eta squared would be our effect size. Notice that the decimals are lined up within the columns. So if I didn't physically manipulate that, then basically the numbers would start either being centered within that column or they would be left justified. So you want to use the center or the decimal tab in your word processor to make sure that the decimals line up. Notice that there are no vertical borders within the table, and I would recommend very, very strongly to create your table in a word processor, not in Excel or Google Sheets. You have a lot more flexibility with regard to formatting in a word processor table than you do in a spreadsheet program. And I know some people feel very strongly that they should use the spreadsheet because it kind of puts everything in cells for you, but it really is not ideal. So in either case, the default is that you're going to have vertical borders around all of the cells and that there are horizontal borders as well. And so you're going to go in and turn them off. The only ones that you should have left would be a horizontal border above and below your column headers, and then a horizontal border below your last row in the table. I do have a short video posted in Blackboard that shows you how to create a table that complies with APA. So that's not a part of the quiz, but if you'd like to go and take a look at that at any time, it's pretty short. It's about 8 minutes, but it will take you through all of the steps so that you get a nice looking table pretty easily. The last thing that I want to talk about is the appropriate way to incorporate figures into a document. So with regard to figures like this one, basically graphs, or it could be some other type of picture-related information or graphic. So the figure number is italicized. It appears below the figure and it ends in a period. So it's kind of opposite of the table. Table numbers are not italicized. They appear above the table. So figure numbers below the table in italics ends with a period. So just a lot to kind of keep track of. And then we don't really have a figure title per se. Instead, there's a figure description. So that starts on the line that has the figure number. You only capitalize proper nouns or the first letter of the first word in a sentence, and that figure description should end up in a period overall. So hopefully you learned a little bit that will be useful to you not only in this class but beyond. And if you do have any questions, be sure to let me know.